Welcome to this Cal ICH training on household management. Let's start with some basic level setting and define household or households. The fiscal year 2024 HMIS Data Standards Manual defines a household for the purposes of HMIS as a single individual or a group of persons who apply together for a project for assistance and who live together in one dwelling unit, or for persons who are not housed, they would like to live together in one dwelling unit if they are housed. I have included a visual to show various household types. Of course, this is not inclusive of all households. Here we see examples of a single individual household, adult-only households, adult and child household, multiple and children households. The important thing to remember is that for all household types, there must always be only one head of household identified in a project enrollment. The yellow stars in the next few slides indicate the person who is identified as the head of household. Relationship to head of household. Relationship to head of household is one of the universal data elements that is required to be collected on all adults and children in a project. Response types for relationships to head of households are self, which denotes the person who is identified as a head of household. This can be thought of as a primary client or eligible individual. It is not intended to mean the leader of the house. Head of household's child, including stepchildren, adopted, and foster children of the head of household, regardless of their age. For example, I have a 22-year-old and 20-year-old child. If I was presenting for services, although my adult children are adults, they would still be included as head of household child. Next, we have head of household spouse or partner. This is a significant other of the head of household, whether in a marital or de facto relationship. Head of household's other relation member. This can be grandchildren, nieces, nephews, cousins, or other relatives, regardless of their age. Last, we have other non-relation member. Groups of people may self-define their households or families, which may include other non-relationship members. How do projects determine who is the head of household when groups present together? The fiscal year 2024 HMIS data standards provides the following guidance. If the group of people is composed of adults and children, an adult must be indicated as the head of household. Other than this restriction, each COC must develop guidelines for defining and designating a household member as the head of household and seek to ensure that those guidelines are applied consistently across participating continuum projects. A particular funder may provide instructions for determining which household member should be designated as the head of household in projects that they fund. If the funder's instructions conflict with COC guidance, the requirements of the funder should supersede COC guidance for the relevant projects. Let's talk about some of the data entry complexities that are often found with households while they are enrolled in a program. While the data entry is completed at the provider level, it is important for HMIS trainers, HMIS system administrators, and any staff overseeing project level data to understand the complexity of household exits and how to accurately capture and edit that information in HMIS. If you currently don't have household changes or exits in your training curriculum, please feel free to use the examples in the next few slides. On the next two slides, we are going to look at what needs to be done if the head of household leaves a project while the other household member or members remain. In example one, a two adult-only household enrolls together in a project. At the time of the enrollment, person one is identified as the head of household, and person two is identified as the spouse or partner to person one. A few months later, person one exits the project while person two remains in the project. When this occurs, the other member of the household currently participating in the project must be designated as the head of household, retroactively to the beginning of the household's enrollment. The other member's relationship to the head of household should be edited to reflect each individual's relationship to the newly designated head of household in the event that it differs from the relationship to whoever was previously identified as the head of household. Records of the changes do not need to be retained in HMIS over the course of a project stay. The head of household is swapped out, backdating to the start of the household's enrollment. If the head of household is not updated when person one leaves the household, this will result in errors in additional data elements other than the relationship to head of household, which we will cover in upcoming slides. For example 2, we will look at a household consisting of adults and a child. This can also be applied when there is more than one child in the household. In this example, we have a household of 2 adults and 1 child enter the project. Person 1 is identified as the head of household. Person 2 is the spouse or partner and the child of the biological child of person 2. But the head of household does not associate the child as any relationship to them. So the child is identified as other, non-relation to the head of household. A few months later, person 1 leaves the household, while person number 2 and their child remain in the project. The relationship to head of household will need to be edited to reflect that person 2 is the head of household, and the relationship to the head of household will also need to be edited for the child since they are the head of household's child. Additionally, a new adult enters the household and is identified as a head of household spouse or partner. One thing I do want to mention is that when it comes to backdating and or editing a client's record for relationship to head of household status, you will want to reach out to your vendor for your workflow on capturing the data correctly. Here are common household errors that are seen in HMIS. In a household of 2 adults, no one is identified as the head of household. Sometimes this can be a data entry error, but I have also found that it can be because a COC does not have clear guidance on determining the head of household. As mentioned in a few slides back, each COC must develop guidelines for defining and designating a household member as a head of household and seek to ensure that those guidelines are applied consistently across participating continuum projects. So yes, this is data that is entered into HMIS, but there are still guidelines about the certain data elements where the COC provides input. Remember, a particular funder may provide instructions for determining which household member should be designated as a head of household in projects that they fund. If the funder's instructions conflict with COC guidance, the requirements of the funder should supersede CO guidance for the relevant projects. In a household of 1 adult with children, the head of household exits the project and the children are not exited. This type of error is usually a data entry error, where maybe the household was not correctly entered at project entry, or if a child was born while the head of household is in a project, they were not correctly added to the household. When only the adult is exited from the project, the child will still have a response of head of household child, but there is no identifying head of household since the adult who was the head of household has exited. In a household of 2 adults with children, the adult identified as head of household leaves the project and the remaining adult is not updated to head of household. This type of data entry error will show that this household does not have a head of household. If there is not a head of household selected in a project enrollment, or if the head of household is not updated when the original head of household exits a project, or if a child remains in the project without a household, other errors will appear in the data quality report. This is because the HUD data elements, such as housing move-in date, prior living situation, and current living situation, are collected and reported based on the response of the head of household. I've worked with communities and providers when receiving a data quality report, and they only look to see if data is entered for a client and think it may be a system error in the data quality report because a client's record has data entered. When a situation like this arises, users should be instructed on how to ensure that there is at least one person who is identified in the head of household in the project enrollment. Other data elements that may be affected are enrollment COC, the date of engagement, CE assessment and CE event when applicable. Income and non-cash benefits apply when there are only children remaining in the project enrollment. Here are some tips on how to avoid or reduce household errors. Provide household exit training for providers. Again, please feel free to use the examples from the previous slides and add your own examples for other household data entry errors you have seen in your community. I would suggest using this as a follow-up data training. Teach providers how to run reports at the end of the month, ensuring that children who are stayers have an identified adult as head of household. If you are not sure if your vendor has a report for this, your providers can run an APR report to look at the household compositions. Q7A, number of persons served, or Q8A, household served, is the report number that you can look at on the APR report. Most household errors are corrected in October as part of the LSA process. However, Cal ICH encourages you to monitor this quarterly prior to uploading to HDIS. Thank you.